My name is Aditi Anand, and I'm the head of creative content at the Migration Museum in London. I'm really delighted to be joined in conversation today with the Singh Twins. We're very lucky to have a piece by the Singh Twins in an exhibition we did in 2017, which was called All That I Am. And this summer, when we were planning our exhibition called Heart of the Nation, which is all about migration and the making of the NHS, I found out about the piece that they produced about NHS versus COVID-19, fighting on two fronts. And the piece really just encapsulated so beautifully what the exhibition themes were as well, which is all about the kind of underappreciated and overlooked role of Black and minority ethnic people and migrants in producing and sustaining the NHS and what it is today. But I think beyond that, it also asks really deep and challenging questions. So I wanted to start by just kind of asking you how the idea for this piece came about.
Bit of a sad beginning, really, because we lost a good friend of ours who was working in the NHS. So we were quite angered by what we saw as really unnecessary death because of the lack of PPI that was being provided to the hospitals by the British government. And so we wanted to do tribute to the NHS, I guess, as much as in his memory as it was kind of praising the kind of great work that the NHS was doing in such difficult circumstances. And just coinciding with that, we happened to have been approached by a TV production company who were making a programme for Channel 4, an arts programme called Grayson's Arts Club. And they were looking to see what artists were doing around the country during lockdown. So we just started this piece, and it really gave us an incentive to make a headway on it in a very short time, because we were actually asked to film ourselves creating the artwork because they weren't allowing film crews, obviously, to come to homes at that time with the lockdown. So it was kind of a double stress in actually trying to create it and film, at the same time. But it did give us that impetus to get the work finished at a time which otherwise wouldn't have been able to do, because lockdown, certain projects came to a grinding halt, so we had other kind of commitments that we couldn't pursue, and that freed up the time to enable us to actually create this work.
And how long did it take actually to bring it all together?
We had to finish it within a week because the production company needed a week to edit, and their program itself was a very quick turnaround, because they were responding to the moment, as it were. But having said that, a week is a very short time for us to create work in any case. But this particular piece is a mixed media digital work, so it draws a lot on some of the painted elements from previous artworks and incorporating that with a lot of new material created digitally within the computer, which it's still quite a time-consuming process, but nothing like the time it would have taken to actually paint this entirely by hand.
So is this the fastest you've done a piece?
Actually, no. I think we did. I think we'll talk to you later about another piece, which actually we had to turn around in maybe a couple of days, wasn't it? It was even faster. But yeah, it was a bit of
a precedent that you're setting for yourself.
We find it familiar with filming, with painting under pressure, because quite a few years ago we were doing another piece just following Princess Diana's death, and it was a portrait on her. And again, it was coinciding with a company that happened to want to do a profile on us at the time and wanted to follow us working on a piece. So that again was a week turnaround, wasn't it? So we're becoming used to working under extreme pressure.
You spoke a little bit about just all the different aspects of the piece. So maybe just to start, let's talk about that sort of central figure in the piece.
Well, the central figure is actually based on traditional images of St. George, the patron saint of England, which we've interpreted as an Asian nurse from the NHS or National Health Service, and she's slaying the COVID dragon. He was quite appropriate because it's basically a story of a hero, fighting in defence of the defenceless. That's the kind of analogy of St. George figure. And, we felt it was quite appropriate to represent the NHS as this, the knight in shining armour, if you like, coming to the rescue of the people of the country under, really difficult circumstances, and putting themselves in the front line, really, to try and save us from this awful virus.
One thing I kind of noticed in the piece was right below the central image, you have a quote there, and I wanted to find out more about the meaning of that.
It's a quote from the 10th guru or teacher of the Sikh faith. And it was really the starting point, actually, the inspiration for why we went with the St. George theme and the whole idea of the battlefield, because it talks about life being like a battlefield, and about performing good actions within this life and asking for God to give you the strength to do that, and have the courage to die if necessary, to do the right thing in life. So it was translating that analogy, if you like, to the situation of the COVID virus, and how the NHS are basically fighting on that battlefield, and doing good work and sacrificing really their own health and well-being for the sake of others. And the battlefield in this case symbolically is representing the hospitals. And the way we've made that reference is there's a flower growing on the battlefield, which in mythology is associated with the field of medicine. St. George is also very interesting because although he's the patron saint of England, he's actually of Turkish origin, which is quite ironic, really, because he's also the emblem of the far right-wing parties, the National Front and all of those parties, who are usually anti kind of immigrants and have a very narrow view of who England belongs to. And so with him being of Turkish origin, he fitted in beautifully with the idea of trying to praise, in particular, the BAME communities, the Black, Asian, minority and ethnic communities that work within the NHS system and have always been the backbone of the NHS itself, and have always been the backbone really of building countries like Britain. If you go back to the days of empire, it was built on the blood, sweat and tears of foreigners, basically. Yeah. And that's actually represented in the artwork through another detail of Britannia. She sits on the landscape behind the main figure of St. George, reinterpreted as an Asian nurse riding the horse and slaying this dragon, which is made up of COVID viruses.
Yeah, it's such a strong image. And I think what you were saying about it kind of exposing some of the hypocrisies is really what makes it so powerful. And I think you do that with quite a few other details in the work as well, that kind of get to the ironies and hypocrisies. So can you talk, are there a couple of other details that you could talk about along those themes?
It does take a little bit of a dig at the whole Brexit debate that Britain has been through. Do we leave Europe or don't we leave Europe? And much of that campaign for the pro-Brexiters was based on the idea that immigrants were, kind of taking jobs and were a drain on the system. So there's a reference within the artwork which actually kind of shows the irony of that perspective, because here you have this Asian nurse on a horse slaying this COVID dragon, and beneath her there's also text which is taken from some of the headlines responding to COVID at the time, many of which talk about how the Black, Asian minority groups are the ones that are at the forefront of fighting this virus because of the numbers that work within the NHS, or the National Health Service, and also the healthcare care worker system as well, outside of the NHS. And they're on the front line, but also they have this added problem, if you like, because the Black, Asian minority communities have been identified as being much more in the high risk factor of contracting this virus than other groups. And so there's another sort of quote in the artwork, which is one of the slogans of the government, which is saying, "In it together," we're all in this together. And really, it has a question mark for us in that it's saying that, well, some of us are actually in it more than others. And it's those very communities which the Brexit campaign were seeking to boot out of Britain by leaving Europe that are the ones that are actually now, putting their necks on the line and showing that they are very much part of Britain and contributing very positively to Britain, as they always have done. Which goes back to the image of St. George as well, really, in a way, because if you're talking about St. George being of Turkish origin, again, it throws in the question of British identity, what it is to be British, or what a lot of people perceive to be Britishness in a very narrow kind of defined white, kind of context. And of course, there are a lot of immigrants who have come to this country that have adopted Britain as their home and feel as British as anybody else who, happen to be born here. So there's also another little piece of irony in the bottom right corner of the artwork, which shows Theresa May as the former Prime Minister of England and Britain, I should say. And she's holding up a placard, which is basically talking about how her government and subsequent governments and previous governments have basically run the NHS into the ground. And I think this COVID virus, I mean, the everyday people knew how important the NHS were, but I think it's really brought home just how invaluable they've been, and the way in which the government has run the NHS into the ground because of lack of funding, support, and various other factors. And also the lack of care they've shown. I mean, with this whole COVID, the whole COVID crisis, there was a big debate about, inadequate supply of personal protection for the NHS workers. So that's one thing that's featured quite prominently within the artwork. You have the nurse who has this protective visor on her face, but it has this huge crack down the middle because, they really were not armed properly for, to defend themselves against this virus. And on the back of the horse, sitting behind her, is a small miniature figure of Boris Johnson, who's sort of digging a knife into her back. And it's this idea of the kind of betrayal, I think, the way in which the government has consistently betrayed the NHS by not supporting them in the ways that they should do. And it had a big campaign of clapping for the NHS every Thursday, showing our appreciation and encouraging people literally to come out on their doorsteps and clap for the NHS. And yet they slapped parking fees on NHS staff. There was also a big criticism about the way that the government handled trying to control the virus anyway. And one of the big things that came out very early on was how a lot of people in care homes, many felt unnecessarily died of the virus because the government allowed people coming out of hospitals, required care homes to take them into their care, to relieve stress from the hospitals themselves. And that led to the virus spreading within the care homes. And one of the phrases that came out in light of that was how in an interview was how the care home staff were basically saying that they felt that the people in there had been led like lambs to the slaughter. So we represent that in a symbolic way in the artwork as well, with a lamb that has the portcullis, which is the symbol of the British government. It's like a kind of a gate, which is impaled in the lamb.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's so important because, like you were saying, with the clap for carers and the kind of outpouring of love we've seen for the NHS, sometimes it has this impact of trying to paint NHS workers as heroes, and actually they're human beings, and they're facing so much uncertainty and losing friends and family and patients, and it's just there's a much bigger story, and I think that's the artwork does a really good job of kind of make people interrogate that story a bit and get beyond the kind of veneer of just the clap for carers.
Yeah, exactly. It seemed a very shallow gesture, and I think even a lot of people in the NHS felt it was quite a shallow, although appreciative on one sense, because they realised that people were doing it from the heart, the general public. There were certain comments again saying, we don't need claps, we need a pay raise, basically, show some proper appreciation. And that's also represented by a little banner in the artwork, which again was taken from some of the news reports at the time. A lot of the details in this work were based on our research of watching the news, but also internet research as well, of the kind of comments and responses of people around the country, really. But going back to this idea of the NHS heroes, which is what they've been dubbed in Britain, again, that ties in really nicely to the symbolism of St. George and the symbolism of the saint in general, because they were really ordinary people that did extraordinary things, and that is exactly what everybody within the NHS and the care home system have been.
Well, you looked at the sort of relationship in Britain and what's been happening with COVID, but another piece that you created is looking further afield. It's looking at America. So I wanted to just find out more about, again, how did that piece come about, and was that also produced during the COVID lockdown?
Yes, the work "Get Your Knee Off Our Necks" is the title of the piece. There were several influences that came simultaneously, I think. One of them was watching the reports about the parallels, if you like, between the high risk factor in UK being the Black and Asian minority communities, and similarly in America being reported that the Black communities and so-called minority communities are also at high risk, and largely because they are, the deprivation of those communities as being seen as sort of almost second class, if you like, to mainstream communities. as a result of poor health and housing and jobs. I guess that has put them in the high risk
one of the factors,
area.
yeah.
So one of the details within this artwork is a virus which has a reference to that. But also it was inspired by, or motivated by, again, news reports on the response to the really tragic murder of George Floyd. And I think, like many people around the globe, we were absolutely horrified by this. I mean, somehow, one hears about racism in America and police violence, particularly against the Black communities. Somehow this event just really dug into to everybody. And there were some quotes by celebrities, people like George Clooney, for example, who used the analogy of the virus to explain racism in America, saying that, this is America's virus and pandemic, and after 400 years, we still haven't found a kind of cure for it. And then
racism is America's pandemic.
That's right. And then you have people like Taylor Swift, who was really criticizing Trump and saying that he was basically stoking the fires of racism, white supremacy throughout his whole presidency. So we really wanted to show how racism in America had a historical basis in the whole history of slavery, enslavement of Africans. So the majority of the artwork, a lot of the details around that, are looking at figures representing historical slavery and linking that to how the Black communities are treated in America today. So you have Trump, who's represented as this kind of personification of the evils of slavery, basically, and the evils of racism. And he's sitting on this perch, or this pillar, which is really, it's called the cornerstone speech, is written on the top of this pillar. And that refers to a speech in 1861 by Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederate government, or self-appointed government at that time during the American Civil War, who gave an address called the Cornerstone Speech, really exposing the extent of racism in America, by which he was basically saying that the enslavement of Africans was justified because they were an inferior race compared to the white race. And I think we felt that that's the kind of mindset, this colonial mindset and attitude, that has really continued right the way through to modern times. And not just in America. I mean, the artwork, at the base of this pillar, you have a map of the world. So it's also saying that this idea of racist attitudes that is rooted in colonial history is something that is a global problem that needs to be dealt with globally, not just in America itself.
And I think we've seen that with Black Lives Matter movements that kind of started in America, but obviously they have a lot of salience in Britain as well. And it's kind of forced us all to explore some of these things in British history, isn't it? About colonialism and the legacies of slavery that kind of persist to this day. So do you really see that as a kind of dialogue between countries in this piece?
Yeah, I think it's systemic racism throughout the world. So I think unless we all come together and recognise it and work together to stamp it out, I think it takes that common effort, if you like, if anything's really going to be achieved in any meaningful way, and not just be another kind of flash in the pan that for a few years or whatever it's on the agenda, and then suddenly things go back to the way they were. It needs to really be something that's long term. And I think that can only happen if the whole world basically acknowledge that, one, it exists, and secondly, make real efforts to eradicate it.
And where does this piece and the NHS versus COVID piece, where does it fit into your kind of larger body of work?
It's a continuation really of the project that we've been working on since 2014. It started with a body of work called Slaves of Fashion, that was sparked off by a visit to the Slavery Museum in the French town of Nantes. And during that visit, we saw some textiles that had been produced in India that apparently had been made for the African markets. And initially, we didn't think they were Indian fabrics because they had little motifs of African huts and palm trees and rhinos, things that you wouldn't associate with Indian motifs at all. And then the curator explained to us that they'd been commissioned by the French during the time where the French colonies were in India to exchange specifically for enslaved Africans
This enabled the French to take part in the transatlantic slave trade. So we were really interested to find out more about India's connection with the slave trade through the trade in these textiles called Indians. And that opened up a whole new door really about how the trade in Indian textiles was linked very much into the global story of empire, colonialism, conflict, slavery. And that led to a body of work which we showed in 2018 at the Walker Art Gallery.
I've noticed that there's a few repeated symbols in some of these works, so it seems to be telling a kind of larger story.
They're individual artworks, but at the same time there is a dialogue between them. So very often we would start a dialogue within one piece through a particular symbol, but then carry on that dialogue within another piece, which would also reference the same symbol, but give more details about the context of the story behind that symbol. So within Get Your Knee Off Our Necks, for example, there are a couple of figures within there that represent enslavement in the Caribbean, and then also enslavement in South America during colonial times. And they're figures that have been used in the Slaves of Fashion series in previous works. And there's also a very strong reference to this idea of, the link between enslavement and trade and the kind of commercial lifestyle that we all embrace. So you have a slave ship, which is surrounded by cotton plants, which is obviously one of the commodities that were traded during colonial times. The slave plantations depended on this produce. And elsewhere in the painting, you have representation of other cash crops, such as tobacco, which were also cultivated through plantation slaves. So the whole image really does bring together those global histories that are common to America, to Europe, to India. And really this piece, although it seems to be a critique of what's happening in America right now, it's really a critique of our shared histories. And it's really our way, we hope, of trying to get people to understand those histories in a much deeper way. And by doing so, hopefully come to a realization that we're all connected in ways that are very unexpected for most people, and with that realization, perhaps there will be kind of a new respect in the way that people view people they so-called think of as immigrants or others or inferior to who they are.
Your work is so, I'm always amazed by how rooted it is in research and this incredible detail. How do you go about researching a series like Slaves of Fashion?
Lots of different sources. It usually starts on the internet to try and, look up, for example, books or documentaries and that kind of thing that we can explore. Libraries, on-site visits, so museums and galleries. So we visit the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool, for example, which has a wealth of material about colonial history and the history of slavery in particular. Diverse sources, really, documentaries. And we really just gather as much information as we can from the start, and then there comes a point where we think, okay, we need to really start, creating the artworks now. As much as we'd like to go on being eternal, students, so we come together and we kind of look at what we found together, and we would identify certain themes. So with the Slaves of Fashion, we identified 11 main themes to begin with. And then we divided those themes between us, and we'd go off independently and hone in on that particular topic, if you like, and try and unearth more kind of information about that. And then as we're creating the works, we've always got our mind on research anyway. So very often we'll come across something midway through a work and we think, oh no, this is just too important to miss out, and we have to somehow find a way of cramming it in because sooner or later we run out of canvas space. So it's sometimes quite challenging because you have to leave out things that you would really love to depict or represent, but the space just isn't there to cram anything else in. And as these two latest works show, the Get Your Knee Off Our Necks and the NHS V COVID, the research never stops. I mean, this is 4 years later after we started the Slaves of Fashion series, and at the time we thought that was it, we've created this body of work and we'll tour it. But since then, actually, even prior to these two works, we've created 2 other large-scale triptych works which tie into the themes of Slaves of Fashion. So it's a really an ongoing progress.
Passion of ours.
I think so.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think your style kind of lends itself to exploring some of that complexity, isn't it? Because you can include so many little details. And I think probably as visitors, we probably miss quite a few of them, but it keeps intriguing you. You kind of go back to the work and discover something new every time.
Well, we hope it's enough for people to kind of whet the appetite to go out and make their own, research and discoveries. It's just enough to hopefully get people talking about certain themes and debates. Just putting that seed of thought really in people's minds. So if it does that, we don't really mind if, we realise people are not going to get everything, that we've depicted in the artwork. Some people will recognise certain symbols, some people won't recognise any symbols. I mean, it's a language, the language of symbolism within art is something that has really not been around for many, many years. I mean, we're inspired very much by Renaissance art, Victorian art, which were heavily, symbolic. And a lot of people in those times would have known, for example, symbolism of the language of flowers. And that's been completely lost in the modern era. So in a way, it's we love to reintroduce that idea of telling narratives through symbols.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of touched on this just now, but I was thinking, we're like obviously living in this time of just heated debates, polarized debates around kind of migration, racism, legacies of slavery. What do you really see as your role as artists?
We both feel it's very much as social, political, cultural commentators. I mean, the art in itself, the style that we work in, people often say is very decorative, beautiful style, if I could put it that way. Yeah. And that's part of who we are in terms of our aesthetics and the language that we choose to use. But I think behind every work there is always a very deep message, and most of the messages that we have in our work are either based on our own experiences of British Asians and that whole cultural debate about dualities of culture and the migrant experience, but also the things that we are interested in and things that fire us up about current politics or ethical trade debates, all of those, or setting history, the record of history straight, giving the other side of the story. So I think art has a very important role to play within that respect. It is a language that's very universal, very accessible, and as a medium, I think it can be a very sort of subtle way also of taking a dig at very hard hitting political concepts and ideas. So we certainly do see ourselves as having a certain degree of responsibility to use our art in ways that are just beyond, creating pretty pictures for, decorative purposes. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but from our own perspective as artists, we're much more interested in using our art as a voice to express how we feel, but also to encourage other people to, engage in really important issues.
Yeah, so we're about to kind of now enter into our second lockdown here in the UK. What are your kind of plans? Do you have any projects to create more work?
Yeah, I guess whilst the galleries and museums are closed, luckily we have a number of private commissions that we're working on to keep us busy, and we have our book for Slaves of Fashion series, which we've started to produce. We need to get that boxed off before the next exhibition. We're also working on another publication project with a Sikh author who is writing about Guru Nanak Dev Ji's teachings, and he has asked us to illustrate that. So we're going to be quite busy, I think, during the second wave of lockdown. I don't think we're really going to get much of a break, but it's good. It's good to be busy and to have people interested enough to commission us to do work.
Yeah. Do you kind of find yourself kind of pushing against the constraints, or do you feel you're okay with this, that this lockdown has kind of given you space to do things?
Lockdown has given us more time to be creative, because if we weren't sitting here, the time we're spending creating here might otherwise have been spent traveling, or very often we travel with our work, meetings or events, and none of that has happened, obviously. So, and sometimes we have to put the works that we want to do for ourselves on the back boiler because we're busy doing the kind of commercial work or the projects, the commissions. So with these two particular works, they wouldn't have happened had it not been for COVID-19 for sure, and being in lockdown, because we had some time freed up from the fact that other projects had come to a standstill. And it's quite nice actually to be able to react spontaneously to events, because very often we're not able to do that because we have other work commitments, and very often we have to, as I say, put our own ideas to one side and don't get around to them, sometimes years down the line, sometimes never. We've got a big long list of things that we want to do, and have been sitting there in the back of our minds for years and years and years. So it's been nice to actually be able to create spontaneously.
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously feeling like everybody, not that suddenly realizing that you don't have the freedom to go and visit friends and family. I think we're all going to or attend arts events. I think we're all going to really relish the day when we're able to do that again. I think we all probably took that all too much for granted before.
Yeah. Well, I think we might stop there. I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to kind of touch upon, or
no. I think we've given a summary of what we've been up to. So I think that's hopefully that'll give people an insight into the works. We haven't covered everything, but I think it's always best sometimes to leave something to the viewer to imagine and
interpret.
Interpret for themselves.
well, thank you. It's been like an absolute delight to have this conversation with you.
Thanks, Aditi.